It is by now nearly half a century ago that climate change became public knowledge when James Hansen told the US Congress that it is largely human caused. I suggest it has been greatly underestimated just how troubling the psychological implications of that human caused would prove to be. Also, because climate change was not addressed back then, we now have a severe climate crisis, and the psychological implications of facing that it is human caused are very much more troubling. It requires people to face that they have participated in a damaging way of living, especially people in the global north, most of us who lead carbon-intensive lifestyles. Now, awareness one has participated in causing damage to the planet and to people and animals can lead to feeling morally injured, with moral injury being the heartfelt and heart-sore awareness that one has violated one's own sense of themis, a term from the ancient Greek meaning what feels right and proper. So, first of all, I'll explore moral injury, and then I want to introduce exceptionalism, which is the mindset that I argue drove the neoliberal economic and cultural project. The culture of uncare that neoliberal exceptionalism fosters, and the fraud bubbles that it manufactures. It is when people emerge from being caught up in a fraud bubble that they are particularly vulnerable to suffering moral injury. So, turning now to moral injury, Joe Glenton, a British soldier deployed in Afghanistan in 2006, went AWOL. Do you know that term? It's absent without leave, rather than return for a second tour. Following months of wandering, he gave himself up and served a custodial sentence for desertion. After Afghanistan, Glenton had many classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, feelings of rage, guilt, shame, loss, despair, helplessness, disorientation, being emotionally conflicted, and losing a sense of being properly oriented in time. Another way to understand some of Glenton's symptoms is moral injury. This is trauma that soldiers experience when they realize that the war they find themselves in turns out to be an immoral war, and that by taking part, they have acted against their own individual conscience. Experiencing moral injury is actually a sign of mental health, not disorder. It means that one's conscience is alive. Mental healing for Glenton began when he just refused to return to Afghanistan. Those who study war resistors describe such moments as involving what's called a crystallization of conscience. And Glenton described his, this is in 2013, as follows. Being a conscious objector is something that develops, and no contract in the world can keep it in check. You feel it goes against the grain of your very being to go back. Glenton had gradually come to understand that army recruitment had sold him a distorted picture involving soldiers as idealized heroes fulfilling idealized noble missions in Afghanistan. He found the reality brutal, and he began to see that the idealizations were cover stories for the brutality. And he concluded, quote, "What radicalizes soldiers is when they understand the impact of policy on individuals and on the people they care about." My talk's argument is that neoliberal culture, which I'll go into a bit, recruits people to participate in an immoral project, which is to live daily life in a way that collectively causes huge environmental and social damage and is unsustainable. It is a culture that actively uncares people, separates them from their caring part by encouraging them to damp down their awareness that even ordinary shopping now faces people with moral dilemmas. Examples are standing in the supermarket, wondering whether to buy flown in fresh vegetables with a high carbon cost and products that contain palm oil, largely grown through destructive tropical deforestation, going online and wondering whether to order from Amazon, whose workers, as we know, are widely considered to be highly exploited, wondering whether to eat meat and dairy from animals maltreated in industrialized mega farms, wondering whether to buy cleaning, health, and beauty products in plastic containers and comprising chemicals whose detrimental environmental effects and impacts are not clearly spelled out. I argue in my book, Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, that neoliberalism's culture of uncare's prime aim is to deregulate people's moral sense through psychological manipulation and invitations to collude. Also, that to understand at a feeling level that one has colluded with this culture can cause the shock of moral injury and can radicalize in just the way that Glenton described. The French journalist Benjamin Carl researched, this is in 2014, researched where every item in his flat in Paris had come from food to TV to his bicycle, and found that only 4.5% were made in France. Carl called himself a child of globalization. We are all children of globalization, not of globalization as such, but of a neoliberal form of globalization. And it is greenwash to pretend it is easy to live sustainably and to source local products in our current carbon-intensive world. Carl did achieve 96% French-made within 10 months, but only through considerable effort and foregoing items that he thought essential. So how do we live with knowing we are necessarily implicated in at least some of the damage by dint of living in such a morally deregulated economy? Robert J. Lifton in 2014 called awareness that one's implicated in causing the climate emergency formed awareness, to distinguish it from awareness that does not include this moral aspect. Formed awareness is currently largely psychologically defended against with denial that is augmented by the culture of uncare, in particular through encouraging disavowal, a form of denial that does see the harm, but that minimizes and normalizes it. Stanley Cohen, the sociologist, extended his concept of implicatory denial, meaning it's not I who's causing the damage, I'm not implicated. He extended that concept to include implicatory denial of climate change. I've argued, 2014, that in order to process what we already knew back in the 1980s, that climate change is largely human caused, most people need a framework in which to be able to think proportionately about just how big is their own responsibility. We don't have a framework like that. Also, that a law of ecocide, I can go into that more if you like in the discussion, proposed by the international barrister Polly Higgins in 2015, would not only make large-scale environmental damage actually unlawful and prosecutable, but it would make it a mental health issue. It would allow people to emerge from their climate bubble of disavowal to start thinking about their own responsibility with a sense of proportion. In other words, ordinary people are not nearly as responsible as the carbon majors, the large polluters and governments who've acted for them. But without a legal framework of ecocide to help people contain their anxieties, they are in danger of swinging between feeling too little and too much responsibility for carbon damage and for lost loved environments. A way of life that has been called American or Westernized is increasingly recognized as largely responsible for rising carbon emissions. However, given its rapid spread to all corners of the globe in the period of financial deregulation since the 1990s, and given recent shifts in global power relations, calling this way of life Western is no longer accurate. It's not just Western. A deep-rooted mindset lies at the heart of this way of life. It centrally involves the belief that the whole world is just our oyster. It's there solely for us to exploit, with the justification that we're entitled to, as we are especially worth it. You know, that L'Oreal hair advertisement. Why? Because I'm worth it. The mindset became a subject of attention in the human sciences during the period of neoliberal deregulation. Social psychologists called its underlying values instrumental. Sociologists and social commentators called the mindset consumerist and extractive. Psychoanalytic authors have given it various names: narcissistic, one of arrogant, greedy entitlement, narrow-minded, perverse, and involving a sense of manic triumphalism. It has been likened to the position of the baby for whom Mother and Earth is seen as an idealized feeding breast toilet, solely there to provide supersized portions and to absorb all the waste products. In this false, idealized fantasy view, Earth as a life support system is as if indestructible. Here we can see omnipotent thinking used in order to override our awareness of limits. Each of these descriptions highlights important features of the mindset that I'm describing. The sense of self-importance tending to hubris, imagining oneself with godlike powers when not checked. The sense of special entitlement to supersized portions and supersized comfort. The narrow-mindedness of a purely extractive, exploitative position, ridding the self of experiencing unpleasant, unwanted feelings by disavowing reality. The shallowness of experience that results from all this, the drift to regressive, more childlike modes of thinking, the growing sense of entitlement not to have to tolerate difficult experiences, and the general corruption of truth and language. In my book, Psychological Roots, 2021, I argue that these are all aspects of exceptionalism, which in various guises and social formations has a very long human history indeed. My focus in the book is just the neoliberal phase, but it has a very long history. Václav Havel, for instance, in the 80s, discussed its appearance in Soviet-style culture. Nonetheless, the neoliberal era has been exceptionalism's golden age, and this paper focuses on its neoliberal form. My talk. To give a full account of exceptionalism is beyond my scope, but in brief, to understand it, we need to begin with the ordinary exception and enduring part of the human personality that stubbornly clings to a narcissistic form of entitlement. The exception feels entitled in three main and highly interconnected ways. I am entitled to believe that I am an idealized version of myself. It's an entitlement that I have. I am entitled to have whatever I want. And I am entitled to use omnipotent thinking to avoid any inner discomfort and conflict, especially guilt, that might ensue from holding this position. The exception operates like a kind of inner refuse-neck and control freak. You might picture a 2-year-old in anger, in a strop, on the pavement, refusing to give way, to share, to fit in, demanding to be seen and treated as king of the castle and to claim the biggest share of the cake, attention, and adoration. I'm sorry, but I have to at the moment. I think about our recently apparently departed Prime Minister. And having said that, I don't go in for analysing individuals, but it was irresistible, sorry. Most of us, unless we are saints, have a part like this, and we struggle, mostly successfully, to rein it in. A sense of fairness and moral obligation to others keeps us grounded mostly, and this helps us to contain our inner exception. And group cultures of care also greatly help with this task. The exception sees narrow-mindedly and short-term, in contrast to the caring part of the self that takes a broader view. It is essentially narcissistic, the exception. In discussing narcissism, I will restrict my use of the term to its more destructive forms, as described by such authors as Rosenfeld. What has been termed positive or a normal narcissism, as described by authors such as Kohut in the 80s, I see as part of the lively entitlement of a lively self to have a relation with reality. The exception, as part of the narcissistic self, relies on a psychic organization involving multi-layered and highly organized defensive strategies to maintain itself. This part feels entitled to adoration as being special and ideal, and entitled to exploit the other, to treat the other as a servant, and to use the other for its own gratifications. Its form of greed is arrogating and narcissistic. Part of its sense of narcissistic entitlement is also to be spared any guilt, conflict, and shame over this treatment of the other. However, because a sense of morality and what is fair is also a natural part of being human, treating the other in an inhuman way necessarily leads to a situation, if faced, of conflict, and also to potentially considerable anxiety about damage caused. Manic defenses are employed to render guilt and anxiety apparently insignificant, thus minimizing the healthy triggers that would normally lead people to rein in their excessive behavior. This can cause the damaging and harmful behaviors to escalate. Narcissistic entitlement is key to the exception's position and perspective, providing it with backbone, will, and rigidity. I, or we, the group, would rather die in a ditch than fit in with a reality that limits my or our freedom to do and have what I or we want. We will find an omnipotent quick fix solution. The reality-seeking part of the self also feels entitled, but in a different, lively way. It argues back with, well, I'm entitled to see myself as I actually am, to have my fair share and suffer the life-enhancing pangs that go with a functioning moral self. My answer to my inner exception is that I am not and I cannot be perfect. I have no inherent superior entitlement to bigger shares, to seeing with rose-tinted glasses, to lying to myself, and to living in a bubble. People who are rigidly ruled by their inner exception have found ways to silence their caring part. Where am I? Yeah. Whenever it interferes with narcissistic entitlement. Now, turning to exceptionalism, ISM, exceptionalism occurs when exceptions gain political power and the power to shape a culture. Then it becomes an ism. Exceptionalism clearly involves the psychological and the social. Terms we are beginning to problematize as we first undo what the Argentinian anthropologist Viveros de Castro called the vicious dichotomies of modernity. And secondly, we begin to problematize and to broaden, clearly involves the psychological and the social. Terms we are beginning to problematize as we confront the vicious dichotomies of modernity, and broaden to include the ecological and to recognize that mind does not just belong to an individual. We're undergoing great change in our theoretical structures at the moment. And granted these current complexities, I studied exceptionalism by gathering data from individuals and from society, noting that there are clear similarities at these different levels, and following Wilfred Bion in his view that the life of a mind can be akin to the life of a society. A psychically, socially, and politically constructed mindset, exceptionalism has long historical roots and has taken different, often overlapping and extending forms. And in my recent book, I argue that neoliberal ideology itself is suffused with the exaggerated entitlements and the self-idealizing, omnipotent thinking of exceptions. Neoliberals, on gaining power in the 1980s, set about deregulating the economy precisely to enable arrogating greed and narcissistic entitlement to flourish, and to find omnipotent as if ways not to have to count the true cost and the true harms. If we look at the way the deregulated global economy was structured when it was founded in the 1980s, we see exceptionalism at work. A globalized deregulated economy was founded on trade rules that are a polluter's charter. The polluter never pays, short-term profit is all that counts, the true costs are discounted, and no one must ever be found responsible. At the same time, the neoliberal model is highly idealized by those who insist, well, it's the only way and there is no other way. Products were produced in ways that hugely damaged the environment as well as the social fabric. The damage inevitably started to mount up, but rather than address it, short-term quick fixes were applied. Steps were taken to outsource the damage as much as possible, send it far away, and to play down its effects. Large corporations are by now causing such damage that life itself is threatened. Moving now to the culture of uncare. Exceptionalism is brought about and then maintained largely through the imposition of a culture of uncare. And neoliberals who took power in the 1980s set about putting in place just such a culture. Its specific aim was to deregulate human minds such that people's caring, reality-based part would be weakened and their inner exception would be strengthened. People needed molding and encouraging to collude with the new economy. They should spend more, including accruing debt, and they should turn a blind eye to rising wealth inequality, lowering of workers' rights, and environmental deregulation. The main problem facing neoliberal leadership was people's caring side. People are not either, they're neither entirely selfish nor entirely selfless, and most live conflicted between these two positions. Neoliberalism's culture of uncare, which includes advertising, media, political propaganda, and social group pressure, has worked ceaselessly to boost narcissistic entitlement and to undermine any re-emergence of care and social responsibility. And my book, Psychological Roots, gives a detailed analysis of each branch of culture and how this is achieved. Of course, it relies on collusion. The culture of uncare imposes frameworks of uncare that fracture common ground and establish hierarchies of the more and less worthy and deserving. An example of the thinking involved, I suggest, is revealed in a leaked confidential memo sent in 1991 by Larry Summers, then president of the World Bank, who said then, quote, "I've always thought that countries in Africa are vastly underpolluted. Their air quality is probably vastly inefficiently low compared to Los Angeles. Just between you and me, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to the least developed countries?" Here is exceptionalism revealed. Damage and suffering are outsourced to different devalued others. This memo is also racist in the way it discounts brown people in the global south, consigning them to forming a zone of sacrifice to maintain superior entitlement. And that is shocking. But what is also disturbed and shocked me is realizing ways I too am often caught up in this mindset as part of the culture I live in. Turning now to bubbles. Neoliberal culture essentially seeds bubbles of disavowal, which are as if quasi-imaginary, idealized, cocooned worlds that function to minimize moral unease, anxiety, rage, and grief that people would feel if the real world was seen clearly. Inside the bubble, an unsustainable, inequitable way is thought to be, well, it's normal, it's usual, it's the only way. The bubble is seeded, inflated, and then maintained largely through a culture of uncare, meaning a culture whose perverse aim is actively to regress people psychologically, to boost their infantile omnipotence, and to cause them to disassociate themselves from the part of them that does care and does take responsibility in life. Bion, back in 1948, thought such a culture promotes what he called spiritual drift, and it leaves people psychiatrically disinherited. Now, powerful people foment bubbles for profit and advantage, and they work hard to ensure that it is others, not they, who suffer, especially when the bubble bursts, the fraud is revealed, and the harm can no longer be kept hidden. The financial bubble that burst in 2008 saw bankers profit, while 6 million Americans lost their homes, and austerity measures hit people hard right across the world, with severe ramifications that continue to this very day. Now, turning to climate, oil executives and the political establishment knew in the 1980s that burning fossil fuels leads to global warming. They also knew that to continue burning fossil fuels, they must seed and grow a climate bubble. And they did so largely by putting in place a culture of uncare that by promoting denialism, which is denial that's industry funded and political denial, aimed at to encourage people to minimize their conscious awareness that burning fossil fuels leads to global warming. The climate bubble is actually far more damaging and consequential than any bubble in human history. The fraud has involved extracting all for now, for a few, and leaving life itself bereft of a future. And we're right at the very tail end of being able to turn this around now. The climate bubble involves complex, dynamic group defenses that work to bleach out the violence and the scale of inevitable death from the picture. This bubble is now bursting. One sign being that far more people are talking now about the state of the climate and seeing the harm that's already being done. Hannah Siegel argued that it is maintaining a socially constructed silence that is the real crime. With the climate bubble bursting, some people with money are now bailing out, the usual urge with bubbles. The very wealthy are buying luxury bunkers, individual ones, and ones in large compounds such as those in Slovakia and in the hills of South Dakota. They are designed to withstand what is euphemistically being called the event. And the event for this group includes global warming, nuclear fallout, poisonous air, viruses, and attacks from hostile protesters kept on the outside. The tech expert Douglas Rushkoff in 2019, this is just before COVID, that was the event that was unexpected but hit, described meeting hedge fund managers who asked him how could they keep safe in their bunkers. They wanted tech support with this. Questions included, how could they defend themselves against their own security guards? Exceptionalism could not operate without the construction of bubbles specifically designed to boost and maintain narrow privilege and power and the false belief that endless expansion and growth is possible, the absolutely false belief that it's possible. The bubble serves to prevent ordinary people from seeing violence, exploitation, and human and animal distress that they are necessarily implicated in causing. Bubbles are dynamic, not static. Truth deflates bubbles, while lies and distortions inflates them. Key to preserving the bubble is preserving a state of mind involving exceptionalism. The financial bubble that burst in 2008, just a minute, let me just see, how are we doing for time? It looks all right, okay. The financial bubble that burst in 2008 is widely acknowledged to have inflated through a mixture of financial deregulation, in particular abolishing what was called the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999, that had placed constraints on banking practice, and boosting exceptionalism that unleashed rapaciousness. Currently, we see various bubbles starting to burst. The bubble preserving male privilege, followed by the climate bubble and the environmental bubble. The bubble maintaining white superiority and white privilege is bursting as I write. Well, that was in 2020, this paper was. Underlying all these bubbles is the entitlement to dominate and control, not to connect, to protect, and to seek to understand. Each of these bubbles has, of course, its own long history, and each enables a distinct form of harm to go unchecked, through that harm being kept psychically minimized by those inside the bubble. And I would add that the suffering is to be felt by the group directly affected. We don't have to bear the suffering. I added that. Each also leads to overburden of planetary systems, of Black people, women, poor people, animals, and children. To be overburdened is to suffer conditions that are too much to absorb and bear without distress, humiliation, the sense of abjection that comes from being disrespected, rage, anxiety, and trauma. And trauma, as we know, will revive earlier individual, family, and intergenerational trauma. The economist Kate Raworth in 2017, who put forward her donut economics, I can go into this later in the discussion if required, which is a model of economics for a sustainable world, described two crucial sources of overburden: planetary overburden and social overburden. And her form of economics actually puts these both together and links them. Both planet and people need to stay within certain prescribed and by now largely known boundaries. And both can tip into instability when these boundaries are breached and conditions become too much for systems or organisms to bear. Naomi Klein noted that the term overburden is used by the mining industry to refer to everything and everyone standing in the way of one's extractive intent. To be in this mindset is to live in a mental bubble inside of which one is as if morally deaf, blind, and dumb to the harmful effects of one's actions. The deaf ear selectively turns down the volume on the damage and suffering that one causes, and the blind eye minimizes or distorts it. The dumb mouth expresses itself through silence as its answer to any dissent and challenge. In addition, dehumanizing prejudice keeps the bubble in place by mentally fracturing the perception of common ground and seeing the group hierarchically, as racialized and gendered. That way, the other is rendered not one of us, and so not entitled to the same resources. Life inside the neoliberal bubble tends to be focused on extraction and consumption in the here and now, with time assuming an ever ongoing quality that scotomizes the future. This is necessary as in the future, a dreaded event lies, the inevitable bursting of the bubble and a reckoning, because it's when the bubble bursts that the fraud is seen, and so is one's collusion with that fraud. Only then is the scale of the damage and the harm fully revealed. Now, bubbles are hard to see when one's inside of them. That's what they're for, to protect one from seeing clearly. Partly, this is because the damage and harm they do tends to build cumulatively through a process of slow violence. Rob Nixon's wonderful name for and analysis of the way in which environmental and social damage builds slowly until tipping points are reached. Reality breaks through and the underlying violence is exposed. The bubble is precisely designed to protect against knowing one is part of a problem that will and must cause others to suffer. Think of the heady, socially sanctioned state of mind that enabled people to take out mortgages they could not possibly afford to repay during the financial crisis, that bubble. Think of the problems of the parents, think of the parents who shower their children with goods produced in an unsustainable way. Do they factor in that they are robbing their children of a future? Children have started to confront their parents to say that they want to live far more sustainably. And when they do confront them, too many parents in the bubble still respond with deafness, blindness, and silencing. I'll say more about that in the discussion because we know a lot more about that now, and what the children and the young people are feeling. The underlying issue is that their entitlement and privilege of the parents must be preserved, even when their own children will be sacrificed on the altar of that entitlement and privilege. Of course, this must not be seen too clearly. So, turning to emerging from the bubble, people trying to emerge from the climate bubble of disavowal and trying to face reality with their caring part in charge are likely to experience not one, not a few, but a whole series of shocks. The first being that climate news is itself shocking. And by the way, I'll just put in a sentence. My idea about emerging from a bubble has been, and my whole idea about the bubble is very influenced by John Steiner's work on psychic retreats and the difficulty of emerging from psychic retreats. And here you have group retreats where you've projected into the group all the difficulties and so on. So people emerging from the bubble face really acute problems. Not one, not a few, but a whole series of shocks. The first being that climate news is itself really shocking. Global warming is now underway and everywhere. We can go into that more later. That is shocking, but more shocking is that warming has started very recently to speed up rapidly. The problem with climate reality is we tend to feel either too much or too little about it. We veer between shock and disavowal, and neither state helps us think rationally, by which I mean thinking that can contain and help us work through our feelings and our bodily reactions. I'm going back to the question that was asked me in the previous hour, how do we bear this? In addition to shock at the news itself, people are likely to feel assaulted by feelings that being in the bubble has protected them from. Shame can suddenly be particularly acute. When I first heard about the vast number of animals who died in the Australian climate-caused bushfires, I felt ashamed to be a member of my own species. Some feelings released will be melancholic and potentially paralyzing. Others, while very painful, are lively and they're part of grieving. Neoliberalism's culture of uncare's perverse aim has been to try to prevent people from seeing the damage and harm that their culture causes, and I think this is crucial, to work to nip any sign of grief in the bud. It's much more comfortable with a denial and anger, but never move on to grief and actually accepting the reality. That's the aim of the culture. So 11, 12. A further shock is realizing more clearly that most leaders currently in power are continuing with policies leading to ecocide. And this means that in effect, leadership does not care if people live or die. Surely our leaders cannot be that collectively crazy. This is very hard to bear. Now, I'll just add that I'm aware that the situation, for instance, in the UK or the US is very different to the struggles that are happening in Europe in relation to climate. But I want to actually say that to date, the climate issue is not being tackled by leadership with anything near the urgency that it needs, anything near. And so I stand by what I just said. So it's very hard to bear that we're that collectively unloved, basically, and unrelated to. Then there's the collapse of our own omnipotence. That can cause further shock. We have radically to reevaluate our sense of ourselves. We see that we are vulnerable and unprotected when we thought, without thinking, that we were invincible. Death suddenly feels closer and more real. We see how easily seducible we are, how prey we are to colluding with corrupt forces. And we feel shocked to see that we were duped and that we allowed ourselves to be duped. It is also deeply replenishing to emerge from the bubble, which is after all a collective psychic retreat from reality, and see the real picture. It puts us in touch with our lively entitlement to conditions that support life and that make life sustainable. We realize we have been steadily losing these conditions through a process of slow violence. Only with the true picture can we make real, genuine repairs where we can. Stepping out of the climate bubble enables us to see strength and beauty in the interconnected, complex systems that support life, and also to see the fragility in those systems and the imperative for us to respect their limits in the way that we live our lives. The task of processing guilt and responsibility is different when emerging from the climate bubble of disavowal, is difficult, when emerging from the climate bubble of disavowal, but it is particularly difficult when emerging because of relentlessly industry-driven denialism at the point when extensive damage has already been done, and some of it is now irreparable. At these moments, people need support from their groups to process their shock, and this support is naturally not forthcoming from groups that are trying, mostly unconsciously, to maintain the bubble. Groups within a culture of care can and do function to support people at these times. These groups promote care and engagement, especially with the work of collective mourning needed to face reality at our grim moment in history. Extinction Rebellion and the work of many, many groups such as the Climate Psychology Alliance, Psychologists for Future, which is very active in Germany, and the LEAP in the United States, facilitate mourning and offer support to develop a new imagination that can dream of and can picture and feel a healthy sense of entitlement to dream of and picture a viable future. That requires confronting the past truthfully. It has to involve mourning and getting back into a relationship with truth. Just one example of such a confrontation is the US Army veteran Wesley Clark Jr., who in 2016, leading a ceremony at Standing Rock in which Army veterans asked Native Americans for forgiveness. Quote, "We didn't respect you. We polluted your earth. We've hurt you in so many ways, but we've come to say that we're sorry. We're at your service and we beg for your forgiveness." I've been very moved, just extra to the paper, I've been very moved to learn a lot from the military, actually. I believe breaking with the current culture of uncare requires a collective effort of working through grief, remorse, and a reshouldering of responsibility. It matters greatly that this is undertaken in a spirit of forgiveness of self and other, based on an understanding that we too have an inner exception. When, for example, I blame the oil industry or the politicians, which I do, it tempers my rage, making it sadder and more reflective to realize that I too have contributed to the problem. With the Black Lives Matter global protest in 2020, we have seen even more clearly that climate and environmental effects are disproportionately borne by those with brown skins who live in the global south and in poor communities in the global north. The protest is fueled by people across the racial divide who see that our current economic system is based on disregarding the very people who provide food, services, and care. The people described by Naomi Klein in 2020 as caring hands. In a bubble of disavowal, these essential groups are disappeared to become the zones of sacrifice. Seeing the damage and the harm as the climate bubble bursts means seeing with greater feeling and empathy the burdens of generational trauma stemming from historical inequalities. That is also empowering and can energize resistance and forge deeper connections. Fred Alford in 2016 had noted that, quote, writing on moral injury, noted that, quote, it would be careless in the literal sense of being uncaring, not to recognize moral injuries' presence amongst us all, some more than others, but everywhere. He made the crucial point that, quote, moral injury occurs when command is casual about killing. Many people now see just how casual many current political leaders are about their lives, their children's lives, and life itself. COVID-19 exposed already existing cruel disparities between the haves and the must not haves, and exposed casualness about numbers of deaths. It would be surprising if this did not lead to increased moral injury, particularly in people with greater privilege. Part of moral recovery is people, and facing that they are injured, is people realizing that their faith in leadership has been misplaced, and demanding leaders that they can genuinely trust. Here it is worth pointing out a key distinction between post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury, which is also classed as a trauma. PTSD involves a loss of safety, sense of safety, whereas moral injury involves the loss of a sense of trust. Very often both occur together, with untrustworthy leaders offering us fake safety. I believe it is also important to work through our disillusionment with ourselves, that when caught up in the bubble, we listened to our own inner voices that were untrustworthy and that corrupted our thinking. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Oh, there's one last little paragraph.
I was wondering.
Yeah, shall I read that?
wondering.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I missed the page. Yeah. So just to end, I find the marvelous Robert J. Lifton in that paper on formed awareness of climate, 2014, he put his finger on what it takes to emerge from a culture of uncare and why we need to help and support each other. And to quote Lifton, quote, people are coming to an awareness that it is deeply wrong, perhaps evil, he said, to destroy our habitat and create a legacy of suffering for our children and our grandchildren. Okay, now I've finished.